So next we have Kendra Dunn, who has a very long title. She's the Child Maltreatment Prevention Director at the Office of Early Childhood and co-lead for the Strengthening Families Coalition. And she is going to provide an overview of the Strengthening Families.
I don't know who did the likes for the video, but
oh yeah,
that'd be awesome. That's my fan. So I see a lot of familiar faces in the room. So I'm going to ask you guys first to just raise your hand if you already do Strengthening Families work or know about Strengthening Families Network. Okay, so that's kind of what I thought. So I'm going to start with an activity. Today we've been sitting for a little while. And then I'm going to do a quick overview. And just to explain, we are videotaping this, so it can be used in the future. So I am going to still do a high-level 20,000-foot overview, but I'm going to rely on you guys a lot more to type up and give examples and have a discussion with me as we go through this, okay? All right, so if you guys would all stand up, and I'm going to ask you to go find someone you don't know as well. And I'm going to give you 4 minutes to talk about this question, okay? Yeah, Abby's got to find someone. There's some people up here. That's the problem. If I know you, then I can call you out. Okay, so here's the question that you guys are going to answer. Remembering back to your childhood or youth, what is the most important lesson that you learned about being a good parent? Make sure you both get an answer.
Say it one more time.
Okay, thinking back to your childhood or youth, what is the most important lesson that you learned about being a good parent? Right, so what was that experience like? Someone want to give me feedback? Did any of you experience any discomfort at first about talking about things that maybe felt kind of personal?
I think the second question was a little more personal than the first question, so that one felt a little more like, oh, okay, I have to think about this answer for a minute.
It was harder to get started.
Yeah.
I was just struck by where we got on our struggle around asking for help on that second question, and how culturally, you know, and then how that's reflected in our services.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it just trickles down.
This is a snippet of an exercise that I use when I'm training, whether it's providers or families. Because I think one of the things about the Strengthening Families framework that it's so important is that it's really about all of us. In 2001, the Center for the Study of Social Policy in DC was given a really large grant, a gift, truthfully, from the Doris Duke Foundation, with the charge to go out and find a new way to prevent child abuse and neglect. And I happened to live in DC at the time and got to participate in some of those early big stakeholder meetings. I by no means get to claim any responsibility for the framework. But I remember how overwhelming those meetings were, because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know that so it's that idea of like, what we're doing isn't enough, it isn't working, we're not moving the needle. You know, we've raised awareness, but we haven't reduced child abuse. What do we do? How do we do something new? And at the time, we were still really focused only looking at risk factors, right? How do we predict who's going to need help and what kind of help do we need to give them? And so truthfully, this seemed like a really big charge. So the first thing that happened was kind of hammering out of some criteria. What do we need a framework to do? What should this work do? And there's this list created, you know, ideally, whatever we come up with, it's got to be national in scope, it's got to work all across the country, it's got to be systemic, so not just work at the individual or family level, but also at the community and society level of a social ecological model. Therefore, it has to have a population level impact, it's got to reach a large number of children. This whole idea of saving one child at a time, not working fast enough. It needed to really be far upstream. The impact needed to be felt long before child abuse or neglect actually occurred within a family. Ideally, it would promote optimal development for all children. This was a huge transformation of an idea for us, is that not only were we going to prevent child abuse and neglect, but we were going to promote child development. Truthfully, that was like an aha. That was a breakthrough moment. It was going to be strengths-based, so we were going to meet families where they were, we were going to meet communities where they were, we were going to meet systems where they were, and start from that point. It was going to be universal. And remember I said a couple minutes ago about this whole, it's about all of us, it's about you, it's about me? This approach was absolutely designed to be for all families. Not just those families, not families at risk, all families. And that it needed to engage new partners. We needed new messengers, we needed new people to infiltrate our communities with these ideas, right? Because the small group of people that were preaching to the choir wasn't enough. So, just historically, I think this is helpful to understand where the Center for the Study of Social Policy went from there is they embarked on 2 projects. One, they did a meta-lit research, right? What has anybody ever written ever on what prevents child abuse and neglect? And then the second thing they did was, again, kind of different and kind of exciting. They did some exception analysis. They actually identified 20 high-performing early childhood development centers around the country, and they sent researchers out there to basically observe, to just spend time watching what is going right. Why do these centers have low turnover among their staff? Why are their families have, good longevity, great health outcomes, good transitions into kindergarten, right? What is working? And then at the end, they took those 2 bodies of research and they laid them over on top of each other. And what fell out were 5 protective and promotive factors. So, because CSSP is a research think tank, obviously, often they start from things like logic models, right? And I think it's important to know both the stories and the research base. So this is the most current version of the logic model for the Strengthening Families framework. The outcomes, I'm going to start and go backwards. The results that they really were looking for, I kind of already addressed with you. Strengthening families, optimal development, prevention of child abuse and neglect, right? To get there, they identified these 5 protective factors. I always feel a need to kind of caveat here. These aren't the only protective factors that exist, right? If you go through research on substance abuse prevention or working youth development or many other fields, you will find other lists of protective factors. So that's not just to say these are only 5. It's just these are 5 that we know will prevent child abuse and neglect and existed in those centers that were doing things well, right? And so for us, they became the most important 5. That's not to say 20 years down the road we won't discover there's 2 more that we need to do too, right? So in looking at that, how do you build the protective factors? They really looked at it from 2 levels. There's some things that have to happen different at the system level, and there's some things that have to happen different at the program level. Both looking at how they engage families, how they engage parents, but recognizing that those activities might be different if you're sitting in a program versus if you're sitting in a system, okay? And then they really kind of got to what they're now calling core functions. For those of you familiar with the framework for a long time, they called these the levers of change. Anyone heard that term? But basically that we need to be building partnerships with parents, we need to be doing education, we need to be doing policy and practice change, and that we need to be doing some kind of ensuring accountability. So that would be things like building these kinds of the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework into RFPs or into contracts, or utilizing some regulatory levers in addition to using education and parent partnerships. Does anyone have any questions about the logic model? Basically, to sum up, there are 4 big ideas that overarch the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework. The first one is its approach. It's not a curriculum, it's not a program, it's not a model. It's a way to think about and look at the work that you do and potentially transform it in a way that can have more impact on promoting optimal child development and preventing child abuse and neglect. So it's not about doing more, it's maybe doing a little different or thinking a little different. Most importantly, maybe talking a little different. Because one of the things the Strengthening Families framework gave us is it gave us a common language among early childhood, among child abuse prevention, among family support, among child welfare, to start thinking about and talking about the work that we do with families using common language that we could all kind of wrap our heads around. The second thing, and I highlighted this before, but it's important, is that it was a focus not on risk factors, but on protective and promotive factors. We're going to recognize the good, and we're going to build more of the good, instead of focusing all the time on the bad. Okay? The third thing is that it was about truly deepening our relationships with parents and really partnering them with them in a way where they help drive the work, right? So this was really about working with families, not telling families what to do. And so that's a really important thread through here. And oh my gosh, I just totally blanked on the fourth big idea. So I'm going to use my notes, which I'm going to try really hard not to do. But anyway, that's okay. We're all human. Oh, and this is also important, because this is the part that will continue to shape it over time, was that the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework, it needed to help align practice with the newest knowledge in developmental science. So as our knowledge of child development and human development changes and grows, this approach, this framework, needs to move along with it. The framework now is almost 15 years old, and so last year they actually invested a lot of money into some new research, which is on the CSSP website, I'll show you at the end, to really do that, to really look at how has our knowledge of child development and developmental science changed since we initially created this framework, and has that changed how we need to talk about, live, look at each of those protective factors. And then they put that in a new report that they released at the end of last year, just to make sure that we're regularly doing that, because part of the idea was this is supposed to be bringing science to practice. Okay? So, with that in mind, I went ahead and redid the activity early, because everyone had kind of been sitting and getting a little tired, so that was the activity. You guys already did it. We did the activity as a way to introduce ourselves initially to some of the protective factors, and to really just kind of start talking about them and thinking about them. The 5 protective factors, it's funny, I'm going to do something today I haven't done before, which is I usually talk about the creation of these 5 protective factors the way that CSSP originally talked about them, which was to say, you know, there's 4 protective factors of things we do with parents, and there's 1 protective factor that we build with children, right? However, in the past year, in the opportunity of working with Carrie and starting to really grapple in my job with our 2-generation approach, I think within at least my unit at the Office of Early Childhood, we've really started to look at and challenge ourselves to think about how do we do each of these in a 2-generation approach, right? So honestly, how do we look at building social connections for our family, so for parents and for the children? How do we look at needing knowledge of parenting skills and child development? And that one may not seem quite so obvious, but if you're familiar, CSSP has now developed the Youth Thrive framework, which is basically a protective factors framework for adolescent children. And one of the things that they recognized in doing that was that youth need to understand youth development, what's going to happen to me, to my body, how am I growing, how am I changing. And I would actually argue that children need that as well. Long ago, and I think it's probably even out of practice, but 20 years ago, there was this really great child abuse prevention program called Educating Children on Parenting out of Pennsylvania. They actually were implemented here in Colorado in every school until Columbine. Weird connection why, but anyway, why that made a difference. But they would actually partner a new parent and their baby with a 5th grade class, and that mom and baby would come into the class once a month the entire school year, And before they came in, the class would actually learn about human development, and they would make predictions about how that child would have changed, and they'd learn about how you nurture a child. And the child and mom would come in and they would watch them interact, and they would measure the child to see how much they'd grown and what kinds of skills they had. And when that program did evaluation, they actually found some short-term, medium-term, and long-term impacts. The short-term impacts is actually in that school they saw less bullying. Those kids, as they went to middle school, they saw less teen pregnancy. And then in the long term, they saw less child abuse and neglect. So I actually think we have, and I mean, it was a fairly small research study on, a program that was implemented in a couple states, so it was never taken to scale. But I do think there is research out there that exists to show that children's knowledge of human development actually does help promote optimal child development. So I would argue that, again, we need to be looking at what parents and children know about how children grow, and what tools parents need to really help support that growth through the years. Parental resilience, I would argue, right now there's a huge conversation about how we build resilience in children, right? So we need to build it in mom and dad, we need to build it in the kids. Concrete supports in times of need, again, all of the above. Families have needs, parents have needs, kids have needs. As we're bringing resources to a family, we really should be looking at that full lens. Social emotional competence in children. The funny thing is, you can teach children to do this really well, but if they don't have parents that model it or use these skills, they basically don't use them at home, right? So, and it's probably a false assumption to assume that every single adult has really healthy social emotional competence, right? So, so the 5 protective factors are all important, and they're all important for both the child and the parent. I have these introduction slides, and I just want to point out one thing about them. They don't have big talking points or anything, except for to say that even those of us who've been working in strengthening families work for a long time, and now there's 40 states that are implementing strengthening families in some way, have noticed and known for a long time that the academic language is great for the research and for the practitioners at conferences, but it's not the way parents talk about what they do in their everyday life and what they need. And so CSSP is actually, and I wish, I was so hoping it was going to be ready for today, they actually have written a new handout or brochure for parents on protective factors, and it uses parent language, right? So parent partners help write it, and I've used up on my slides their words, their titles that they like to kind of use for these protective factors, just to kind of start getting out there this idea of, we may not always use the formal words. Sometimes when we're talking with people, these are the things that come out, but we're still talking protective factors. So when we're talking social connections, often families and parents talk more about how do they get and give support, as opposed to calling it social capital or social connections, right? I want to point out there's something really important about this protective factor, though I'm sure that most of you understand what it means to have social connections or have friends, have a support network. The important thing about this protective factor is that often I think when we're talking about it, we talk a lot about how to connect parents with each other and how to create opportunities for parents to make friends. And we forget the flip side of the coin, which is part of what families and parents get out of having social connections is also the ability to give. That we all fundamentally as humans feel worthy when we're able to help other people, not just take or get help, right? And so part of this social connection piece is really about the give and the take, and making sure that families have the opportunity to do both, no matter where they are in their life, no matter how many needs they have. Often when you sit down and talk with a family, or look at your own family, you see ways, if you're looking for them, that you are also supporting other people or giving back. And so calling that out and having conversations about that and building on top of that is really important. Does anyone, I did not put slides in for specific activities programs could do, because that's kind of a part 2 piece. But if anyone has any examples of ways that they build social connections, I would love to hear it.
So we have a monthly meeting, I work for something called the Objective Prosperity Project, and we are a relatively new and relatively small project. We've only got about 35 families enrolled, but we have monthly meetings, which all of the families attend, and sometimes there's a guest speaker that's talking about particular resources in the community that may be of need, but a lot of the times it is just a purely social activity for them to get to know one another, develop those relationships, and we do talk about, the terms that we use are sweat equity, sort of borrowing from Habitat for Humanity around that, and so we do talk about how do you give back in some way, shape, or form to each other by taking on a challenge yourself, by supporting somebody else and taking on a challenge they're working with. That's one way. The other thing I was saying earlier, as I was coming downstairs, I ran into a group from our project that was taking a college tour here at Red Rocks, and it was a variety of adults and their kiddos that are in our project that were on the tour. So those are two things I mentioned.
Awesome, that's great. Any other examples? Ways to build social connections?
We have a couple of different ones. One is a direct service example of doing prenatal care group models called Centering Pregnancy. And we have one clinic that's really promoting that. And right now about a third of their prenatal patients receive a prenatal group care delivery model. And then they've extended it with the Centering Parenting program that goes through the child's first birthday. And so that's an opportunity to know. And then kind of more on the, population-based level, along with some of the screenings that we did of Raising Up America, we developed a handout called To Go Along with Buffering Toxic Stress that the Early Childhood Partnership put out that was around what you can do, the things you can do, and it had a parent component, friends and neighbor component, and an advocate. And so one of the things I liked about it is it talks about, get to know your neighbor that might have children or get to know a neighbor. Because I also think that those kinds of connections are important. It's important to bring parents together, but I also think bringing neighbors together is important. And just because your neighbor isn't a parent of kids of similar age doesn't mean that they can't contribute to, your social capital, so to speak. So.
Thank you, that's awesome. How do you build social support in your own life? Or happy?
Go to all these seminars and forums and meetings.
Yeah, right? For sure. If there's something to familiarity, right? If you put the same people in the same space over and over, it does, people start to make connections. They start to know each other's names, for sure.
I was just going to give an educational example. I mean, like the group of people that I went to grad school with, I mean, it was that learning cohort kind of model, and you can replicate that across lots of different post-secondary educational systems, and those are the people that I still keep in touch with, and that, like, we're having kids together, and, all of those things as you continue outside of the program, so.
I'm thinking of my book club that we haven't read a book in about 4 years.
I actually hear this a lot. We started as a book club, but then we really figured out we just like to get together and socialize. Yep.
Yep. So we had moved when our kids were younger to Iowa. Never set foot in the state before. Lived there for 10 years. And really, our first social circles there were around our kids. And the soccer club was our main social outlet. And I still have many good friends that I met because our boys played soccer together.
Great, thank you for the examples. All right, so let's talk about knowledge of parenting and child development. We're going to talk about learning more so we can parent better. I think the key thing about this bucket, truthfully, is we've always done this in child abuse prevention. We've always known that kids don't come with a manual, and so we need to help parents learn more about what they can expect in terms of how their children might develop, and what kinds of things they can do to parent with pulling their hair out a little bit less, right? So we have all kinds of formalized ways to do this. We have many, many, many parenting class curriculums. We have parent support groups. We have home visiting programs that share child development information. So I always make a point here to kind of point out all those other things, all those other ways that families get this information, because they also get it from family and friends. They get it on the internet. There are books in the library about parenting, right? Like, we're inundated. There's stories on TV. It feels like these days we're pretty much inundated with messages all the time about how you're supposed to parent and what's good and what's bad. The thing about this protective factor is that honestly it's become totally overwhelming for parents, right? You can take any issue at all, so think sleep, right? And there's a huge continuum of opinions about what's best, right? So you either let your child cry it out, or you do attachment parenting, and everything in between. And if you're a new parent and you don't, this is your first child, you don't have a lot of experience with children, and you go on the internet, or you start talking to people, you get all this conflicting advice. And that's really overwhelming. And so what often happens is parents kind of take in limit, like, okay, I'm only going to pay attention to what my grandma says, or, because they don't really know what's good or what's safe or what they should believe or what they should know. So one of the things I encourage programs to do around child development and parenting is, for sure, know how to refer to those kind of formalized programs. Another thing that you can do if you're not going to offer those programs within where you are, have a list, of here are some websites we think are pretty good. Try to filter and vet some of that information and make it available to parents in a way that feels less overwhelming. And when I say filter websites, ideally what I would suggest is find websites that have more, that don't use inflammatory language, that aren't one extreme or another, right? That kind of use more moderate, factual types of formats, and that recognize that there's a range, right? So families, we want to encourage families to make the decisions that feel right for them, that will fit within their situation and their culture. And so no matter what topic that is on parenting, you're going to have a little bit of a, somewhere in this range is a good thing, right? So, we try to suggest books and websites and things like that kind of fit in that moderate range and that kind of acknowledge there is a range. And we try to kind of stay away from really promoting the things that really are very inflammatory or, really try to get people stirred up into one extreme or another. Because then if that parent doesn't feel comfortable there, then they've got nothing, right? They don't really know where to go from there. So, any thoughts on how you guys have seen this done well, or anything new you've heard recently? Yep.
I'm wondering about this one, and if it'll transition over time to this concept that the Center for the Developing Child is promoting around skill building and parent competence. So, rather than the approach being it's our job to assure parents have knowledge, it's our job to assure parents feel competent and feel confident in making their own parenting choices, whatever they are. And that's kind of a shift. In one of the pieces of my work is with Fussy Baby Network Colorado, and there's an approach that really tries to build that parent confidence and competence, and isn't so much about what should I do about my foot, or what's the magic bullet,
Yeah.
Should I swaddle, should I not swaddle? But it's really more about how are you going to come to that choice, and so that hopefully it then becomes applicable the next time that you have a crisis or an urgent matter in parenting and you're not sure what to do, that you have the skill to kind of sort through the information and make a decision.
Yes, I do absolutely think that that concept of confidence and competence is kind of ever present here. So I think you are kind of seeing that evolution. I do also think you're kind of seeing that evolution to human development, right? Birth to death, right? That we're kind of, there is no end point where we stop developing. I mean, the Strengthening Families Protective Factors framework was really initially developed looking at children 0 to 8, right? But now kind of with that two-generation lens and Youth Thrive looking at the adolescents and stuff, I think we are kind of going to that life course model. But I love that language around competence and confidence, because that's what really allows parents to, then if they need information, feel, know how to go get it or feel comfortable going and getting it. And not feeling like I have to know everything about everything already to do this well. Right? So, any other thoughts on parenting skills or child development? Okay. So parental resilience, be strong, not stressed. And also, there's another national model that uses build your balance. But really looking at what is resilience and how do we build it. And just to clarify, this is not to say we should let people experience horrible things as long as they know how to be resilient, we're good, right? But even as we simultaneously work to prevent, things from causing trauma, we also do recognize that there are things that happen in all of our lives that couldn't be prevented or weren't prevented, and yet if we had a supportive relationship, if we had some resilience, we were able to learn from that and turn that into part of our strength, building kind of future. Like we were able to take that, work through it, and then we had the confidence to say, wow, I got through that, right? I didn't want to, but I did. I managed to make it, and look, I learned a couple things along the way. So I just always feel like I need to say, we're not saying resilience so that no matter what bad things happen, a child will be fine, but we are saying this has to be part of the mix, right? Parents and children need to be resilient. We live in a changing environment, things are constantly changing. How do we help humans develop in a way where they're most able to deal with that? So the definition of resilience that we've been using is resilience is a positive adaptive response in the face of significant adversity. So that adversity could be anything, right? It could be something, ongoing and systemic like poverty. It could be a one-time experience of violence. Yep.
One thing I'd like to say about parental resilience is I just think it is very, what's the word I want? The other 4 protective factors all wrap around to support that resilience building.
Right, yes.
So that parental education is going to help that parents bounce when they need to bounce with that kiddo. It's going to help the kiddo to develop their social and emotional competence because they have a parent who can bounce through the adversity. The concrete, the supports are going to help build resilience. So all 4 of the others, I think, really support and wrap around resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look through this list, you can see all of the other protective factors that are present, right? So the thing about building resilience is it's everything from things that are inherently in us, like our own faith or our own sense of hope, to informal supports, to potentially formalized concrete supports with issues like mental health or substance use, right? So it's, taking a stress management class, it's doing mindfulness training or taking a run every day, connecting with the church, right? It's all of those things that we do to kind of keep us, sorry, for a minute there I had Dory from Finding Nemo, just keep on swimming, right? It's all those things we do to keep on swimming, right? So, so there's lots of things here that we can help families do in building in routines around safe self-care. There's lots of things we can do with providers around building in self-care for those who work with families, right? So it's really at every level. Again, it's about all of us. Like, it doesn't work if, we build in the child but we don't build in the parent, or we build in the parent but we don't build it with the program that they're working with, or we build in the direct support position but we forget to teach the supervisors and managers, right? Like, these things are parallel processes. They're happening all at the same time. So building resilience within a community at the same time as we're building it within a family is really helpful. Just 2 kind of notes at the bottom, things we know. We know that children who have experienced as ACEs, so adults who have experienced ACEs as children, often need extra support in building that resilience. So just kind of a caveat there, the more kind of adverse experiences you have, probably the more additional support you need around building resilience and supporting resilience. And that's not to say they don't already have some resilience, right? This is a how do you reinforce, strengthen, increase. It's not to say, obviously most of the people who have experienced adverse childhood experiences are resilient. It's just how do we support that and build that and continue that. And then obviously, children with challenging behaviors often need additional supports around this regard as well. Concrete supports in times of need. Checking on the time here, I need to be wrapping up. I think this is the most obvious, right? Like this obviously is all of the formalized supports, the programs that exist to help families, anything that they could potentially need. Response to crisis, daily needs, services for parents, services for children. I haven't added, but should add services for the dyad, so the relationship between the child and the parent. The only thing I want to say here about concrete supports is that it's not just about referrals, right? Referrals sometimes are a first step, but there's two other pieces around these kinds of things. So not only do we need to have these services, not only do we need to refer to them, we also need to change community norms or reinforce community norms that says it's okay to ask for help, that we're all in this together, right? Because if we don't remove some of those cultural barriers to getting help or asking for help, then having these services available doesn't do a lot of good, right?
Can you show the slide right before this? What was
Sure.
the parent-friendly way to say this?
Get help
Help
when you
when
need
you
it.
need it.
And then the last one is around social emotional competence in children, help children manage feelings and relationships. That's kind of where they're headed with that. So this is everything from, how do I say this? So since most of you in the room are kind of from the early childhood space, you'll know that obviously over the past 5 years, there's been a huge movement from within the early childhood community to add social emotional work and curriculums within early childhood development centers and preschools, right? What hasn't kept up pace is how we teach parents about this and teach them to do those things with their kids if they don't send their kids to early childhood development, right? So truthfully, I don't think all kids in Colorado are showing up to kindergarten or showing up to first grade, because kindergarten is not even entirely mandated, with the same skill level around social emotional competence, right? So you have some who really have, have had very intentional skill building, and then you have some that have had no intentional skill building, and anything that they've learned by just modeling the social interactions, the parents and the siblings that they're around. So I think the big idea here, and this is important because I don't think your average parent always hears it, is this doesn't just happen. Just like you have to teach numbers or teach ABCs, you have to teach kids how to recognize and label their feelings. You have to teach kids how to negotiate conflict. You have to teach kids how to problem solve. You need to teach kids how to make friends, how to give a compliment, right? All of these things. And the more intentional you are about it, the more you really kind of come at it from that skill building perspective, the better off these children are at being able to express their needs and wants. And the thing about having kids who are really good about expressing their needs and wants is that they're easier to parent, right? They act out less. And what's really beautiful about children who have social and emotional competence is they grow up to be adults that can do all of the protective factors as adults and for their children, right? So this is kind of an important linchpin, right? Of like, we need to do this right with kids and their parents at the same time, because that will help us build a generation of kids and parents who can do this well. So, any examples of how you've seen this done? I'm going to say like outside of like Pyramid or Touch Points or Incredible. Like, so outside of some of the formalized early childhood programs that do this. it's hard to come up with any, right? Yep.
There's an organization in Denver called the Conflict Center, and they teach social emotional skill building to reduce violence. So it's a violence prevention program, and they have parent education programs, and then youth programs, and parent and child programs. And one of the things that they've done is to create a feelings magnet chart, and we've all seen variations of it. And parents are taught to go home and use that tool to really talk about all of the different feelings that one can feel. And you can move the magnet around, like, how am I feeling today? And when I worked there, I had 2 young girls, and they were little at the time, and I'd take it home. And it was a way for them to really expand even the way we talked about emotions at home, and then to like 30 different types of emotions. And then they talk about why they're feeling that way, and then I could show how I'm feeling, and they can understand how I'm feeling as well as express how they're feeling. And that simple tool opened dialogue in ways that no parenting book ever did.
You know, it's funny because, I've been teaching this a long time. I feel like I know a fair amount about the topic. But last year I took a seminar through the University of North Carolina on the newest research in positive psychology and positivity. And one of the things, and this was so basic, and it was like, the first week in the class or whatever, they asked you to name, like, how many positive emotions can you come up with? So, it's quick, we can do it here. How many positive emotions? You guys just go ahead and throw them out there.
Happy.
Good.
Excited.
Happy, excited, what?
Joyous.
Joyous.
Surprised.
Surprised. Okay.
Elated.
Elated, what?
Ecstatic.
Ecstatic.
Thrilled.
Right?
Grateful.
Grateful, okay. So I've heard some variation on happy, like lots of good words to describe happy. Grateful's a little different, and I heard surprised, right? It's hard, right? There's like dozens of positive emotions, right? But apparently there's like 12 really big, important ones. But we don't teach our kids positive emotions. So, we get really good at like helping them refine and list out all the negative emotions, right? But we forget to teach the other side, right? And so things like, some of the ones that really surprised me were things like interest, like being passionate about something, learning, right? Like that feels good, right? But we never label it as a feeling and reinforce it for kids, right? So there's all kinds of things, I think, in this realm that we're still realizing that we, still aren't kind of intentionally skill building around, right? And if you're lucky enough to live in a family that has a really positive person and kind of models some of that naturally, you get it. And if you don't, you might not. Right? So, all right. I think we're almost there. So how do you get started with the Strengthening Families work? The thing we talk a lot about with Strengthening Families is that it's really about finding one small thing and doing that one small thing, and then finding the next small thing, right? It's not about having big buckets of money. It's not about starting new programs. Remember, I started by saying it's really about thinking different, doing things a little different, responding to things a little different, looking at them through a different lens. So we're really looking at small incremental changes among a lot of people, right? Like a population of people doing small things incrementally to make big change. So some of the suggestions we make are things like talk to staff, talk to teachers, talk to parents, talk to community partners, just start having conversations like we did today around asking for and needing help, around what it means to be a good parent, around positive emotions, right? Start having those conversations and thinking about how that fits in to the work that we do and the life that we live. If you want to take the next step, there are self-assessments. If you want to go from there, there are the protective factor survey. There's ways to measure change among protective factors, right? But really what we're looking for is to light a spark to get people to commit to one small thing. Go meet your neighbor. There's a ton of resources now around this work. I want to point out 2 in particular. One, strengtheningfamilies.net is the CSSP website. That's where you'll find the online self-assessment tools. They've now developed different assessment tools for different types of programs. They're in English and Spanish. The Protective Factor Survey link is there. There's also a database tool you can use to collect that kind of data. There's guidebooks. There are action sheets. They have really nice new 2-page, or 1-page front and back fact sheets on every single protective factor. And the front does a really good job of defining it in depth and talking about it. And the back is literally a list of here are all the things you can do right now to start working on building that protective factor. And then I'm going to point out there are classroom trainings available in our state through a lot of the early childhood councils through a training called the Strengthening Families Toolbox Training. But it's a big commitment, 17 hours, you have to wait for someone to offer it and get it. So we always kind of promote the free online training. There is a 7-module free online training here at ctfalliance.org that goes through all the protective factors. There's a little bit of customization. It will ask you from the beginning, do you work in family support, or are you a parent? Do you work in child welfare? And then it tries to kind of customize a little bit of what you see based on what you select. A lot of organizations, I think the state has done this in the past, and also local early childhood councils in the past have granted certificates for completing the training, so you could use it for contact hours. So I always point that out. The other thing that's not on here, but I want to mention, is Colorado is one of those 40 states working on this framework. And we do have a Strengthening Families Network that has quarterly meetings. We had a conference in 2014. We're looking to do a next conference fall of 2016. So if you're not on that yet, if you want to, Brenda and I co-chair that. If you want to reach out to either of us, we'll make sure you get on that list. And just because of where we are today, to mention that Strengthening Families Network does act as an action team for the Early Childhood Colorado Partnership to really make sure that we stay engaged with the work that's happening. And so if you haven't connected, that's another way you could get involved. And there's my contact information.